guy who coined the brick has come up with the mint. Have you heard that? Some people haven't. Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. All right? So you have floating in the world of multipolarity that we were discussing, the emergence of other powers. And I would ask you, Professor, to look at the second to last page of my paper. I cite a point made by Jeffrey Bader. There is a quote there, and I think it's a very meaningful quote. And Jeffrey Bader was Barack's senior advisor in the National Security Council for Asia, Far East and Asia. And he happened to have been a colleague of mine when I was working on the China desk. And this guy, when I did my stint, he made China and that part of his entire career, and he ended up in the National Security Council. And he makes the point that competition among rising powers, China in particular, should not be interpreted as adversarial. It should be seen as competing for. If it is seen as adversarial, it certainly becomes a reality later. So I would ask you to look at Jeff Bader's. But America the hegemon. If you remember, since you're stakeholders in this paper, if you remember, I said that the American image was sagging during the Bush administration. That was one of the difficulties that Obama had. And he had to resuscitate or revive it, right? This sagging image. The image then was of the hegemon. Obama is trying to divest himself or American leadership as a hegemon by saying that there should be regional leaders in countries that can help steer those countries out of the difficulties they have. But at the same time, they themselves could become regional hegemons. So if you look at British colonial rule, right, versus French colonial rule, just to give you a kind of elliptical analogy, there is rule through direct rule or indirect rule, right? So if Obama were the hegemon and he had hegemons in regions, he'd be ruling through them. But he doesn't favor the emergence of hegemons, and he doesn't think of himself as a hegemon. What you think of yourself might not necessarily be what you are, right? Many people are in self-deception. It's a common phenomenon. So global stewardship relates to whether the United States should have primacy in the world. Obama's position in the document I urge you to read is a National Security Strategy document of 2013. And the President is speaking tonight, and you're going to have a new document. But I'll advise you, these documents don't change that much from 1 year to another. But that document outlines that Obama is in favor of American indispensability in the world, but in an interconnected world. Not primus inter pares, first among equals, some people might say. There's another thinking on this, Mr. Professor, that some people think that he wants to be an invisible leader. If you remember the intervention in Libya, right? The intervention in Libya, he had the French and his NATO coalition partners took the lead. When they had that problem right down there in South Sudan, just recently, where the Nuers were fighting the Dinkas, and they're going to have total destruction of that country. It's the newest country in the world. Obama consulted with, he and his people consulted with the Organization of African, it's now OU, African Union, it used to be Organization African Union. And he provided some support, advisory, in a military advisor capacity. Even in the case of the Central African Republic, if you go to Bangui, it was total ruin between Christians and Muslims in the center country in the continent of Africa. Was once a French colony. So Francois Hollande and Barack had conversations, and Francois Hollande is the man to handle that, and, you know, we're in it together. We will back you up. And who else? Yeah, he handled. He's saying the French president handled other things. I don't know much about that. Vive la France. But in any event, so I think your question is a crux: how to be a realist and an idealist at the same time. It's really a very profound question, and that dichotomy that's made in the literature, or this is a juxtaposition, is a very valid thing. And it is, and I gave you the case of the Dalai Lama when I was working on Tibet, and, you know, the relationship with Beijing, and you would hear these things in meetings, and people would get up on desks and argue about it and stuff like this. And I lost that battle. But I won a battle later on in Ireland with a Northern Ireland peace process. But that's another story. So, I don't think America is declining, but I think the sad thing is that I think it is a more divided society than a few years ago. And I'm not saying that Barack Obama was the architect of this divisiveness, because he is a person who's trying to make it less divisive. But and that's my honest opinion. It's more acrimonious, more Tea Party, more extremism, more kind of unpleasantries. But trust me, during our lifetime, I don't think America is going to retreat from its position as being an indispensable power in the world. Not what's the term they call it? It starts with X. Exclusive, there's another term that's used. Exceptional. Not the exceptional power, but a power that has a very important role to play. And I don't think Obama is going to supervise the decline of America. Good question, Professor. Good question. The lady.
Dr. Scarlett, thank you very much for your discourse, and it was really very interesting and very thought-provoking. I just wanted to draw your attention to a quote that you have in your paper on page 16, where it says that Obama may be constrained by domestic constituencies who are suspicious of global institutions and declare proposed reforms as insufficient to protect U.S. interests. My question is, does President Obama see multilateralism as an opportunity or a constraint? And do you think he is going to go ahead with the multilateral diplomacy, with the Geneva II conferences in solving the situation in Syria?
What I think has generated such high level of questions is because you know your stakeholders, right? No, I think that's a very good question. I think President Obama is committed to multilateralism. But in order to be a true multilateralist, he should not, in his judgment, give up the relative position of the United States in the presently configured United Nations. In other words, in order for there to be UN reform, right, so that you would embrace the realities of emerging powers in the world in a multilateral diplomacy, you have to also consult with other permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Among them, China. And we all know about kettles, fish to fry, and all of this sort of thing. So in the negotiations that the United States will be having, for example, on a bilateral level with Beijing, on a multilateral level, right? If we develop a relationship of irritating relationship where people resorted to what I call primordial instincts of revenge or whatever that Nelson Mandela, condemned. Some of these little irritants can spill over on issues of greater importance. For example, and I'm talking about the United Nations Security Council, China is in a big quarrel with Vietnam, Japan, and the Philippines over some islands here. China Sea, right. Yes, the Spratlys in here. Anybody who knows fundamental geography, which is a lost art, know that these straits here, Malacca Straits, that over into the Middle East, smaller map, there are some choke points in the world. Yes. No, smaller. So I can see Africa. Right. Yes, brilliant. Here, you know this piracy that goes on here, right? The Somali piracy. You saw movies about it. You know the piracy is going on all over. There's an island out there called Socotra. But anyhow, this area, that's a choke point. Oil tankers and all kinds of things. Coming all the way up to poor Japan, and no oil in South Korea. And there are some choke points, the Malacca Straits and so forth, force people to go around. So from a geopolitical side, when we're dealing with Beijing, right, and we say, Beijing, you shouldn't be beating up the Vietnamese or the Filipinos claim it too. Where's Philippines? I used to live there. I used to write about this in my reporting years ago. If you develop a big argument where you have to take sides, well, Philippines' claim is more legitimate than mine and yours and so forth, and the Japanese and so forth. These things have a way of being contagious in terms of other issues, multilateral issues. So when you come to the Chinese and you say, guess what happened, Xi Jinping? I think we need to change up the configuration of the Security Council, where only 5 of us have veto powers, Only 5 of us, we have veto power. We need to change it. And Beijing, Xi Jinping says, no, I'm not going to do that because there's some other things that I want you to do for me. So the bilateral relationship sometimes comes out in the multilateral. So when that's at that level of diplomacy, but at the level at home, when he says to people at home, well, we think that the United Nations should be reconfigured, you know what people are going to say? Are you going to give up your power position there in the Security Council, in this so-called multilateral world? No, we're not for it. And then there's a big hue and cry of people writing about it and getting on television and so forth, and Obama will be faced with that. So reforms, if you say we're going to reform the United Nations, the first thing oppositionists will say, reform it into what? Are we giving up our power position? But I think in principle, Obama believes in multilateralism. However, I'm going to give you a little caveat now. There's an organization called the International Criminal Court. You know about it, right? Rome Treaty, and it became based in The Hague and so forth. It's not the same court as the court of the former Yugoslavia. I've been to that court in The Hague. It's not the same court that dealt with the Taylor in Liberia and all of this. And there's another court in The Hague called IJC. International Court. You as a UN person would know that. Well, the ICC, which is now trying to capture or get some of these leaders in Africa, in Uganda and so forth, before them, we are not signatories to the United States because we required Senate, right, Barbara? Senate approval, so to speak.